In 1844, a 38-year-old man was murdered by a mob while in police custody. His followers numbered about 25,000 people scattered across a few towns in Illinois. They had no country, no army, no wealth, and they were so hated by their fellow Americans that multiple state governors had ordered their expulsion or extermination. 180 years later, that murdered man's religious movement has 17 million followers in 176 countries. It operates universities, owns agricultural corporations worth billions, runs one of the most sophisticated missionary systems on earth, and has influenced American politics, business, and culture to a degree completely disproportionate to its numbers. This is not a story about religion. This is a story about how a persecuted minority, pushed to the edge of survival, built a parallel civilization so resilient that it outlasted every power structure that tried to destroy it. For the next 8 minutes, I'm going to show you how Joseph Smith went from farm boy to prophet to presidential candidate in 14 years, what he claimed that made him the most hated man in America, how his followers survived systematic extermination and turned a desert wasteland into an empire, and how the Mormons achieved something almost no other religious movement has accomplished, building a self-sustaining civilization that operates as a state within a state. This is the untold story of civilization building under impossible conditions, and what it reveals about power, adaptation, and survival. Let me start with Joseph Smith, because you cannot understand the movement without understanding the man who created it. Smith was born in 1805 in rural Vermont to a poor farming family. He had almost no formal education. At age 14, he claimed an angel appeared to him and told him that all existing churches were false and that he had been chosen to restore true Christianity. At age 18, he claimed the angel led him to golden plates buried in a hill, inscribed in an unknown language, which he translated into the Book of Mormon. The book described Jesus Christ visiting ancient America after his resurrection, establishing a civilization among Native Americans, and prophesying about the restoration of his church in the latter days. This was not just a new interpretation of Christianity. This was a claim that God had given new scripture, that prophets could still receive revelation, and that Smith himself was a prophet equal in authority to Moses or Isaiah. To mainstream Christians, this was blasphemy. To Smith's followers, it was the restoration of divine truth that had been lost for centuries. By 1830, Smith had published the Book of Mormon and officially founded the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He was 25 years old. What happened next is one of the most compressed cycles of growth, persecution, and violence in American religious history. The Mormons established communities in Ohio, then Missouri, then Illinois. In each location, they grew rapidly through conversions and immigration. And in each location, they were driven out by mobs, legal persecution, and eventually state-sanctioned violence. Why such extreme hatred? 3 reasons. First, their theology challenged Protestant Christianity's claim to exclusive truth. Second, they voted as a bloc, which gave them political power that threatened local majorities. Third, Smith introduced polygamy, the practice of one man marrying multiple women, which violated every social norm of 19th century America. Now let me show you the decision that changed everything. By 1844, the Mormons had built Nauvoo, Illinois, into a city of 12,000 people, larger than Chicago at the time. They had their own militia called the Nauvoo Legion, numbering 3,000 armed men. They had their own court system. And Joseph Smith was running for President of the United States on a platform that included abolishing slavery and establishing a theocratic democracy. He was the most controversial figure in American politics. And on June 27, 1844, a mob of 200 men with painted faces stormed the jail where Smith was being held on treason charges and shot him to death, along with his brother Hiram. The Mormons faced a choice. Their prophet was dead. Their city was surrounded by hostile neighbors. Illinois authorities made it clear they would not protect them. They could scatter and assimilate. They could submit to legal authority and renounce their beliefs. Or they could leave, not just leave Illinois, but leave the United States entirely and go somewhere beyond the reach of any government that had failed to protect them. Brigham Young, Smith's successor, made the decision: Exodus. Between 1846 and 1869, over 70,000 Mormons migrated west, not all at once, but in waves. The first companies traveled on foot, pulling handcarts when they could not afford wagons. Later groups used organized wagon trains. The journey from Illinois to the Great Salt Lake Valley was 1,300 miles through territory with no roads, no supply stations, and hostile native tribes. Hundreds died of cholera, starvation, and exposure, but they kept coming, because the alternative was staying in a country that had proven it would not protect them from extermination. Here's where the civilization building begins. When the first Mormon pioneers reached the Salt Lake Valley in July 1847, Brigham Young immediately laid out a city plan based on a grid system with blocks 10 acres each and streets 132 feet wide. This was not accidental. Young was creating a template that could be replicated in every Mormon settlement across the West. And that is exactly what happened. Within 20 years, Mormons had established over 350 settlements from Canada to Mexico, all following the same urban plan, the same irrigation systems, the same cooperative economic model. This was not random colonization. This was planned empire building. The key innovation was water management. The Great Salt Lake Valley receives less than 15 inches of rain per year. Nothing grows without irrigation. Within 1 year, the Mormons had diverted mountain streams into a network of canals that irrigated 5,000 acres. Within 10 years, they had over 75,000 acres under cultivation. This was the largest irrigation project in North America at the time, built entirely by hand labor using shovels and oxen. And the system worked because Young established one iron rule. Water belongs to the community, not to individuals. You could use water for your farm, but you could not own it or sell it. This collective management of the single most critical resource was what made survival possible. But Young did not stop at survival. He wanted economic self-sufficiency. He banned the importation of goods from outside Mormon territory and established cooperative manufacturing. If the community needed nails, the church organized a foundry and assigned men to work it. If they needed clothing, the church imported machinery and trained workers to operate it. This was not free market capitalism. This was command economy organized by religious authority. And it worked because the alternative was dependence on non-Mormon merchants, who could cut off supplies or charge exploitative prices. Now let me show you the global expansion, because this is where the Mormon system proved its resilience. Starting in the 1850s, Young sent missionaries to Europe to recruit converts. These were not casual evangelists. They were trained in languages, given specific geographic territories, and instructed to target skilled workers, miners, engineers, farmers with experience in marginal lands. Between 1840 and 1890, over 85,000 European converts migrated to Utah, most of them paying their own passage or being subsidized by a church-run emigration fund. This was engineered population growth. Every new arrival was selected to fill a labor gap. And here is the genius of the system. Those converts did not just join a religion. They joined a civilization with its own economy, legal system, and social structure. If you were a Swedish farmer who converted, the church arranged your passage to America, assigned you land in a Mormon settlement, integrated you into an irrigation cooperative, and connected you with other Swedish-speaking Mormons. You were not entering a foreign country. You were entering a parallel society that took care of its members in ways that no government or private company could match. This is why the Mormon system survived when other utopian communities collapsed. Most intentional communities in 19th century America, the Shakers, the Oneida community, Brook Farm, lasted 1 or 2 generations and then disappeared because they could not sustain themselves economically or demographically. And the Mormons survived because they built a reproduction system. Families were central. Polygamy, before it was banned, allowed rapid population growth. Education was mandated. Children were raised inside the community with strong social pressure to remain. And the missionary system constantly brought in new converts to replace those who left. By 1900, Utah had a population of over 276,000, almost all Mormon. The church owned or controlled banks, newspapers, railroads, sugar refineries, and retail cooperatives. Brigham Young had died in 1877, but the system he built kept functioning. The federal government forced the church to abandon polygamy in 1890 as a condition for Utah statehood, and the church complied. They sacrificed the controversial practice to gain political legitimacy. This is adaptation, not surrender. The core civilization remained intact. Now let me bring you to the present, because the modern Mormon Church is one of the most successful religious organizations on earth by almost any measurable metric. 17 million members in 176 countries. Annual revenue estimated at over $7 billion from member tithes alone. 10% of income donated by faithful members. The church operates Brigham Young University, one of the largest private universities in America, with 60,000 students. It runs a welfare system that provides food, employment assistance, and disaster relief to members worldwide. It sends out over 60,000 missionaries at any given time, young men and women who spend 18 months to 2 years proselytizing at their own expense. But the most impressive part is the retention and influence system. Active Mormons marry other Mormons. They raise children in the faith. They serve in unpaid church leadership positions. They build social networks entirely within the community. This creates an insularity that protects the culture from dilution, and it produces outcomes that are statistically remarkable. Mormons have higher marriage rates, lower divorce rates, higher education levels, and higher median incomes than the U.S. average. They are overrepresented in business leadership, intelligence agencies, and finance, not because of conspiracy, but because the culture emphasizes hard work, obedience to authority, and long-term planning. The political influence is also disproportionate. Mormons represent less than 2% of the U.S. population, but have held significant political power. Multiple senators, presidential candidates, and cabinet members. Mitt Romney, a Mormon, was the Republican nominee for president in 2012. This is not random. This is the result of a community that votes as a bloc, mobilizes resources strategically, and maintains institutions that groom leadership. Let me address the controversies honestly, because understanding the achievement requires acknowledging the costs. The Mormon Church excluded black men from priesthood until 1978, claiming a doctrinal basis that was later reversed by revelation. This was institutional racism, defended as religious doctrine, and then abandoned when social pressure became unbearable. The Church's historical treatment of women has also been controversial, with leadership positions exclusively reserved for men in doctrine that subordinates women's spiritual authority to male priesthood holders. And the Church's opposition to same-sex marriage and LGBTQ rights has led to significant criticism and defections, particularly among younger members. These are not minor issues. They represent fundamental moral questions about inclusion, equality, and human dignity. The Church's defenders argue that religious communities have the right to maintain traditional doctrines. Critics argue that those doctrines cause real harm to marginalized people. Both can be true simultaneously. What is historically undeniable is that the Mormon Church has repeatedly chosen institutional survival over moral progressivism, and that choice has worked in terms of maintaining cohesion and growth, even as it has cost them credibility with outsiders. So what does this all mean? The Mormon story is the story of a persecuted minority that survived by building parallel institutions so comprehensive that members could live entire lives without relying on outside systems. They built their own economy, their own education system, their own welfare state, their own legal framework where possible. And they did this not once, but repeatedly, adapting to new conditions while maintaining core identity. This is the pattern of every successful minority civilization in history. Jews survived 2,000 years without a homeland by building community institutions that substituted for state power. Muslims in medieval Spain built parallel systems under Christian rule. The Amish maintained separate communities within modern America. The Mormon achievement is an American version of this pattern: survival through institutional resilience and collective discipline. The lesson for any civilization is this: power is not just military or economic. Power is the ability to maintain identity and reproduce culture across generations despite external hostility. The Mormons were hunted, expelled, and systematically persecuted. They should have disappeared. Instead, they built a civilization that now spans the globe and wields influence far beyond its numbers. That is not a miracle. That is strategy, discipline, and adaptation executed across multiple generations with extraordinary consistency. I will continue exploring how civilizations survive impossible conditions, what separates communities that endure from those that collapse, and the patterns that determine which cultures persist across centuries. Subscribe. Share this with someone fascinated by how power and resilience actually work. And I will see you in the next one.